Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Commander's Quarters decks are built within a $25 budget that's $25 for 100 cards. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's episode is a patron selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons of this show vote on what commander they'd like to see on an upcoming episode. And the commander that received the most votes for this deck tech was Grand Warlord Radha. Grand Warlord Radha is a 3/4 elf warrior with haste that costs 2 red and a green. She has whenever one or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of red and or green. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. So it's pretty obvious what this commander wants us to do. It wants us to cast creatures, swing with them, and then cast even more creatures. The amount of mana that we can generate in just one turn with this ability is absolutely insane. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we want to get creatures and our commander out quickly. The faster we can get Radha out with some creatures, the more mana that we can generate and the more creatures that we can play. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to swing away, generate a ton of mana, and continue to flood the board and overwhelm our opponents. And since with Radha we're going to be generating that extra mana during combat, we've got some combat tricks up our sleeve too. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's start off with our first tactic. Tactic number 1, Nerd Alert. This deck wants to be fast and have a ton of creatures, so some low converted mana cost mana dorks are perfect. So at the 1-drop slot, we're going to be running things like Arbor Elf, Llanowar Elves, and Elvish Mystic. Arbor Elf untaps the forest, and Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic just straight up tap for a green. Getting any one of these 3 out early can really help us ramp quickly. Another form of early ramp is Skyshroud Ranger. She has tap, you may put a land card from your hand into play this ability only anytime you can play a sorcery. Generally early on in the game we're going to have that extra land in our hand, so she really comes in handy in helping us ramp. Next up we've got Harvester Druid and Naga Vitalist, each of which can tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool that a land we control could produce. And Voyaging Satyr does pretty much the exact same thing in this deck because it's going to tap to untap one of our lands. Since our commander has a converted mana cost of 4, these 2 drops come in perfectly on getting her out on turn 3. So we're also going to be running some more 2 drops like Sylvok Explorer and Quirion Explorer. Both of these creatures can tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool that a land an opponent controls could produce. So not only can these cards help ramp us, but they can help fix our mana depending on the lands that our opponents have. Next up, we've got some temporary sources of ramp with Servant of the Conduit and Channeler Initiate. When Servant of the Conduit enters the battlefield, we're going to get 2 energy, and then we can tap it to pay an energy to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then when Channeler Initiate enters the battlefield, we get 3 -1/-1 counters on her. Then we can tap to remove a -1/-1 counter from her to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then we're going to be running Quirion Elves, Drover the Mighty, and Beastcaller Savant. Each of these creatures can tap for any of our colors without those limits. The only restriction on Beastcaller Savant is that mana can only be spent to cast a creature spell, but the majority of this deck are creature spells. Now, a lot of these mana dorks are great, but we're still not quite done with our ramp package. So let's go through some more ramp creatures with some very unique abilities in tactic number 2, Revenge of the Nerds. First up is Zertaw Druid, which has tap to add green to our mana pool, and whenever we tap it to add mana, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. 1 damage might not seem like a lot, but over time this can really build up. And then we've got Radha Heir to Keld. Radha has, whenever Radha Heir to Keld attacks, you may add red to your mana pool, and then it can tap for a green. So we can either just use this as a mana dork and tap it for a green, or when it attacks, if we've got Grand Warlord Radha in play, it can add 3 mana to our mana pool. But make sure you use that red during combat because it's not going to stay until the end of the turn. And finally, there's Savage Ventmaw, which can generate a huge amount of mana on its own. Because whenever it attacks, we're going to add 3 red and 3 green to our mana pool, and until the end of the turn, we're not going to lose that mana as steps and phases end. And this is on top of our commander's ability, so in actuality, it's going to add 7 mana to our mana pool that is going to stay until the end of the turn. So with just 1 attack, it already pays for itself, and over time, it's going to generate a ton of mana. This deck is all about being quick and generating a ton of mana. So let's go through some ways to speed things up in tactic number 3, Make Haste. First up, there's Fires of Yavimaya, which is an enchantment that says creatures you control have haste, and then you can sacrifice it to give target creature +2/+2 until the end of the turn. Giving our creatures haste is a huge deal for this deck. When we're putting mana into a creature, we expect to get some of that mana back as we swing out with them. By giving our creatures haste, we're going to get some of that mana back right away that we can then use to cast more creatures. So we're also going to be running Ogre Battle Driver, which not only gives our creatures haste, but it's also going to pump them. It has whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until the end of the turn. So not only does this allow us to swing out with our creatures right away, but it's also going to make them into bigger threats, dealing more damage. With this in play, it makes even some of our smallest creatures into bigger threats that our opponents are going to have to think twice about blocking. Again, the goal of this deck is to quickly get out a ton of creatures and just swing away. So let's go through some of those creatures now in tactic number 4, Bring a Buddy. First up, we've got a couple of cheap creatures that also create a token with Goblin Instigator, Nest Invader, and Aether Chaser. Goblin Instigator is going to create a 1/1 red goblin creature token when it comes into play. Nest Invader is going to create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token that we can sacrifice for a colorless. And then when Aether Chaser enters the battlefield, we're going to get 2 energy, and then when it attacks, we can pay that 2 energy to create a 1/1 servo artifact creature token. 2 creatures for 2 mana is great, but it's not quite as efficient as Hanwar Garrison. Because when Hanwar Garrison attacks, we're going to put 2 1/1 red human creature tokens onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. If we can keep this creature alive and attacking for a couple of turns, we can generate a ton of tokens. Next up, we're going to be running some creatures that also generate 2 tokens, but only when they enter the battlefield. Beetleback Chief's going to make 2 goblins when it comes into play, Kozilek's Predator is going to make 2 Eldrazi spawn, and Pia and Kira Nolar are going to make 2 Thopters when it comes into play. They also allow us to pay 2 in a red to sacrifice an artifact to deal 2 damage to any target. Then we're going to be running some creatures that give us 4 bodies for 5 mana. When Emrakul's Hatcher comes into play, it's going to create 3 Eldrazi spawn tokens. In Siege Game, Commander's going to create us 3 goblin creature tokens, and on top of that, we can pay 1 in a red to sacrifice a goblin to deal 1 damage to any target. Finally, there's Cultivator of Blades, which has Fabricate 2, so we have an option when it comes into play. If we need more creatures on the battlefield, we can choose to make 2 servos. But if we need our creatures to have more power when they attack, we can put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Because when Cultivator of Blades attacks, we can have other attacking creatures we control get +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is Cultivator of Blades' power. So if we already have a board presence, Cultivator of Blades can really help us finish off the game by powering up our creatures. Now these creatures are great at putting some bodies on the board, but we also want some more consistent effects too. So let's go through those ways now in tactic number 5, Repeatable Recruits. First up, there's Goblin Assault, which is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste. It also has goblin creatures attack each turn if able. Now we really don't care that this forces our goblins to attack, since we're going to be wanting to attack with them anyway. And getting 1 for free each turn is a huge upside. And then there's From Beyond, which is pretty similar to Goblin Assault. It has, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrifice this creature, add colorless to your mana pool. So unlike Goblin Assault, this enchantment doesn't force us to attack with the creatures that it creates. On top of that, we can also sacrifice those creatures for mana if we need to. Next up, there's Loyal Apprentice, which has Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. That token gains haste until the end of the turn. So as long as we control our commander, we're going to get an extra creature with some evasion each turn. And finally, there's Kazandu Tuskcaller, which just starts off as a 1/1 without any abilities. But once we leveled up to level 2, it can tap to create a 3/3 green elephant creature token. And then if we get it to level 6, it can tap to create 2 of those tokens instead. This deck can generate a ton of mana, and if we've got some extra lying around, we can just use it to level up our Tuskcaller. Getting a 3/3 every single turn is pretty good, but getting 2 of them is pretty incredible. But what if we want to get a ton of creatures all at once? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 6, Mass Multitudes. First up, there's Tilonali Summoner, which can create a ton of creatures for this deck. It has, when it attacks, you may pay X in a red. If you do, create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. Now, at the beginning of the next end step, you're going to have to exile those tokens unless you have the City's Blessing, but with this deck, it's very easy for us to get the City's Blessing. So we can put all of that mana that we're generating with our attacking creatures into this ability to create even more creatures. If we get more than 1 swing out of Tilonali Summoner, our opponents are going to be in big trouble. And then there's Ant Queen, which has pay 1 in a green, put a 1/1 green insect creature token onto the battlefield. This is a fantastic way for us to dump our excess mana into this creature just to create more and more creatures. Next up, there's Wolfbriar Elemental, which has multi-kicker for a green. When it enters the battlefield, we get to create a 2/2 green wolf creature token for each time that it was kicked. And then Chancellor of the Forge can basically double up our board and create us a ton of creature tokens all at once. Because when it enters the battlefield, we get to put X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens with haste onto the battlefield, where X is the number of creatures we control. And again, these creatures have haste, so we can swing with them right away to generate even more mana in that turn. And on top of all this, it has the nice added benefit that if we have it in our opening hand, we can reveal it, and then we get a 1/1 red goblin creature token at the beginning of our first upkeep. Finally, we're going to be running Dragonlair Spider and Verdant Forest, both of which can generate a ton of creature tokens throughout the game. Dragonlair Spider is going to create a 1/1 green insect creature token whenever an opponent casts a spell. Generally in Commander, this means that we're going to get at least 3 creature tokens one time around the table. And then Verdant Forest gives us a 1/1 green sapling creature token at the beginning of each upkeep. So with just 1 turn around the table, it's going to give us 4 creature tokens. Both of these cards may be huge bombs for this deck, but it's important for us to make sure that we don't run out of gas. With as much mana that we can generate, we need to make sure that we have ways to use that mana. So let's go through some ways to make sure that we not only get some more cards in our hand, but the right cards in our hand in tactic number 7, I Dig It. First up is Monvoli Beast Tracker, which when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a creature card with Death Touch, Hexproof, Reach, or Trample and reveal it, and then we shuffle our library and put that card on top of it. Now, technically this isn't card advantage since it's going straight on top of our library, but it is setting us up to draw that right card that we need. And then there's Fierce Empath, which can be slightly better since it is going to put that card into our hand. When it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater, reveal it and put into our hand, and then shuffle our library. And since that card goes directly into our hand, we can cast it right away to make that impact. Next up is Runic Armasaur, which doesn't tutor for us, but it can generate us a ton of card advantage. It says whenever an opponent activates an ability of a land or a creature that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. In Commander, this happens all the time, so we're going to be drawing a ton of cards with this in play. And then there's Garruk's Horde, which has play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. The vast majority of this deck are creature spells, so chances are there's going to be a creature on top of the deck. Next up, we're going to be running Guardian Project, which is an enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Since none of our creatures have the same name, we're going to be drawing a ton of cards with this in play. And then there's Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, but the part that we really care about is whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green. If you do, draw a card. Next up, there's Beast Whisperer, which is even better in this deck because it just says straight up, whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. And Soul of the Harvest is very similar. It says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. With the amount of creature spells that we cast in this deck, though, we're going to be drawing a ton of cards with any of these three. And finally, we're going to be running some spells that can draw us a ton of cards all at once. Shamanic Revelation and Collective Unconscious are both going to draw us a card for each creature that we control. On top of that, Shamanic Revelation is going to gain us 4 life for each creature that we control with power 4 or greater. And then when Regal Force enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card for each green creature that we control. So while this doesn't draw us a card for every single one of our creatures, it is a creature in itself, so it does help us out in other ways. Now, drawing a ton of cards is great, but we need to make sure that we can protect those creatures that we already have in play. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 8, Speedy Recovery. First up, there's Call of the Claw, which has Flash, and when it enters the battlefield, put a 2/2 green bear creature token onto the battlefield for each non-token creature put into your graveyard from the battlefield this turn. Now, while this doesn't protect our creatures, it helps us protect our creature count. So even if someone wipes our board, we're still going to have a ton of creatures afterwards. And then we've got Whisperwood Elemental, which is somewhat similar. First off, it has at the beginning of your end step, manifest the top card of your library. And you can sacrifice Whisperwood Elemental to make it so that until the end of the turn, face-up non-token creatures you control gain when this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. So this card does 2 things for us. First up, it can help us build up our board with its end step trigger. And like Collar of the Claw, it can make it so that board wipes don't set us back too far. Next up, there's Temur Sabertooth, which has pay 1 and a green, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until the end of the turn. Temur Sabertooth is great at helping us save some of our key creatures, including our commander. On top of that, it can really help us abuse enter the battlefield triggers like Chancellor of the Forge by casting them over and over again. Finally, there's Soul of Phyrexia, which has pay 5, permanents you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. And if it's in your graveyard, you can also pay 5 to exile it to do the exact same thing. Soul of Phyrexia is a fantastic way for us to continually protect our board. Now, protecting our board is great, but what about dealing with some of our opponent's boards? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 9, take out the trash. First up, there's Caustic Caterpillar, which we can pay 1 and a green to sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then Reclamation Sage is just going to straight up destroy an artifact or enchantment when it comes into play. Next up is Brutalizer Exarch, which when it enters the battlefield, we're going to choose 1. We can either tutor for a creature card and put it on top of our library, or we can put target non-creature permanent on the bottom of its owner's library. This card is extremely flexible and can come in handy in a variety of situations. Finally, there's Release the Gremlins, which is a sorcery that costs XX and a red. It says destroy X target artifacts and create X to 2 red gremlin creature tokens. So not only can this help us wipe out a ton of our opponent's artifacts, but it can also create a ton of creature tokens for us. Alright, so we've talked about ramping, drawing, creating a ton of creatures, and dealing with our opponent's stuff, but how do we actually finish off our opponents? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 10, GRUUL. First up is Relentless Assault, which is a sorcery that says untap all creatures that attack this turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. Again, with this deck, we're going to be generating a ton of mana during combat, so this spell is basically free for us and helps us generate even more mana. And having an additional combat with this deck can be extremely deadly. Now, as good as Relentless Assault is, it's not quite the golden pig of this deck. The golden pig is the number 1 card out of our 99, and the golden pig for this deck is Hellkite Charger. Hellkite Charger is a 5/5 dragon with flying and haste, and it costs 4 red. It has whenever Hellkite Charger attacks, you may pay 5 red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Hellkite Charger is absolutely broken in this deck. This deck can easily have enough creatures attacking to generate 7 mana. We can then spend that mana for another combat phase and do it over and over again. With the right cards in play, we can overwhelm all of our opponents in 1 turn and win the game. And since it has haste, these wins can come out of absolutely nowhere. It's an incredibly powerful card in this deck that opponents have to deal with right away or they're going to lose. And that's what makes it the golden pig of the deck. And next up, we've got a couple of cards that can help us get those attacking creatures through. First up is GRUUL War Chant, which is an enchantment that has attacking creatures you control get +1/+0 and have menace. So not only does this buff our creatures, but it also makes them harder to block. And then there's War Cadence, which has pay X and a red. This turn, creatures can't block unless their controller pays X for each blocking creature he or she controls. With the amount of mana that we can produce in this deck, it's going to be pretty much impossible for our opponents to block with this in play. And then there's Hellrider, and whenever a creature you control attacks, Hellrider is going to deal 1 damage to a defending player. This card greatly speeds up our kill clock even if our opponents can block. And finally there's Vitalizing Wind, which can be a great surprise finisher. It's an instant that's going to give creatures we control +7/+7 until the end of the turn. So even if just some of our small creatures get through, we can easily blow our opponents out with this card. This deck is fast, aggressive, and a ton of fun. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up is Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Mountain Valley, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for either a mountain or forest and put it onto the battlefield. Next up is Jund Panorama, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to search for either a mountain or a forest and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And then there's Warp Landscape, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we're going to be running GRUUL Guildgate, Timber Gorge, Rugged Highlands, and Kazandu Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a red or a green mana. On top of that, Rugged Highland and Kazandu Refuge will each gain us 1 life when they come into play. Finally, we're going to be running 26 basic lands in this deck. 18 of those will be a forest and 8 will be a mountain. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Grand Warlord Radha EDHREC deck is going to set you back $152.81, so let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.91. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned in focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, there's Avenger of Zendikar, which comes in at $3.65. It's a 5/5 elemental that costs 5 green. It says, when Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. And it also has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. So not only can this creature help us build up an army on its own, it can help us grow them in power over time. And then there's Goblin Rabblemaster, which comes in at $2.88. Goblin Rabblemaster is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior that costs 2 and a red. It says, other Goblin creatures you control attack each turn if able. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token with haste. And whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it gets +1/+0 until the end of the turn for each other attacking Goblin. This card is great at creating a ton of creature tokens over time. Next up is Legion War Boss, which comes in at $1.91. It's a 2/2 Goblin Soldier, which costs 2 and a red. It has Mentor, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token. That token gains haste until the end of the turn and attacks this combat if able. So Legion War Boss is a lot like Goblin Rabblemaster, but can be even better in certain situations. And then there's Beastmaster Ascension, which comes in at $3.27. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a green, and it says whenever a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on Beastmaster Ascension. And as long as Beastmaster Ascension has 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. With this deck, we can pretty much immediately get those 7 quest counters on it and get our creatures huge right away. Next up is Champion of Lampholt, which comes in at $2.16. Champion of Lampholt is a 1/1 human warrior that costs 1 green. It says creatures with power less than Champion of Lampholt's power can't block creatures you control. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lampholt. Not only can Champion of Lampholt become a huge threat with this deck, it can also make all of our creatures unblockable. Finally, there's Aggravated Assault, which comes in at $5.08. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a red. It has pay 3 red, untap all creatures you control. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Like Hellkite Charger, this is a fantastic way for us to get a ton of combat steps and to kill all of our opponents on one turn. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.